and welcome to Business Connections. I'm Holly Allen with the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce. Every year we take a look back at the previous year's economy, and I ask one of our good chamber members to do a little predicting for me, looking ahead to the coming year. So I would like to welcome today Dr. Thomas Traynor with Wright State University. He's Professor of Economics and Interim Dean of the Soin College of Business. Thank you for being with me today.
Well, thanks for having me again. I really enjoy this annual event.
Do you really enjoy it? Because
Yes, I do.
I put you in a tough spot, so I'm happy to hear you say that. Dr. Traynor, we have met here at the start of every year. I think this is maybe our fourth year, possibly. Each time I ask you to make some predictions for the coming year, and we hold you to it because we start the show by looking back at the previous year and some of the predictions you had made for 2018. So I want to start that way and ask you to look back at 2018. What were some of the economic headlines for the year?
So I think the key thing for everyone to realize is really that we had another year of moderate but steady growth. So sometimes when you watch the headlines from week to week, it can seem like we're on the cusp of some sort of terrific event or terrible event, but really it was just another year, as we've had for the last 8 years or so, of moderate but steady growth. Typically, economic growth has been between 2.5% to 3%.
Okay.
We're at the high end of that nationally. GDP looks like it's going to come in at about 3% growth. So nothing spectacular, but continued steady performance. And there's really nothing wrong with that. There's nothing sort of to be disappointed about with that. Unemployment remains really low and it's continuing to fall just as it has for the last 7-8 years. Inflation is low, so there's really nothing bad about the current state of the national economy. It's pretty similar to the state that the economy was in the late 90s, when we had low unemployment, steady GDP growth, low inflation, and a very strong performing economy overall. So it's really just a continuation of the recovery and expansion we had since the Great Recession, and I think that generally should be considered good news. If I were to look at how that compares with what I projected, I had projected a little bit more growth than that. I had projected growth maybe above 3%, a little bit closer to 3.5%, partly because of the Tax Act, the big tax cut and Jobs Act that was implemented, or it was signed in December of 2017, but really implemented over this past year. I thought we'd get a little bit more of a bang out of that than we did. The fact that we are up around 3% growth instead of 2.5% growth indicates we had a little bit of an impact, but not as much as I would have, not as much as I had forecasted or would have predicted. So in that sense, maybe a little bit of disappointment there.
Yeah, well, and as far as that, the tax cuts, we've yet to really see the effects of that, right? Because most of that will be implemented as we file our taxes here in 2019, is that correct?
Well, it depends. A lot of it actually has been implemented in as much as people have already had the opportunity to have changes in their deductions and their biweekly or monthly paychecks, and so they may have already been receiving the effects of that tax cut. In other cases, yes, people won't realize until they complete their 1040s this year, their tax forms this year, exactly how much of a cut they're getting or not. But I would say a lot of this tax cut has already been implemented. So much of it went to corporations in the form of reductions in their profits taxes. They know exactly how much of a cut they've had. They've made significant stock buybacks based on that. So most of that activity has already been happening. So while the tax cut hasn't been fully implemented, or the effects of it haven't been fully felt, a lot of it really has.
Okay. Well, you talked about the steady growth, but as we look back on 2018 and some of those headlines you mentioned, we probably would have been surprised to hear that there was steady growth, because it just seemed every time you turn around there was something going on. One of those things had to do with trade, because our new president has been in the White House and his administration was busy in 2018 making some decisions. Among those decisions were some trade negotiations happening, especially with China. Can you talk a little bit about how it could have affected our economy in 2018?
Right. So on the trade side of what the administration is trying to do, it's really has a much smaller effect than the tax policy change has. So most of what's happened in terms of trade negotiations or outcomes from trade negotiations have been relatively small. A relatively small number of industries that are really active in trade are really being affected by this. So we can point to steel, aluminum, dairy, somewhat the auto industry, and you start running out of industries that are really being directly affected by these policies. Now there are other policies that are indirect, or other industries that are being indirectly affected, but sometimes those unintended consequences are positive, sometimes they're negative. So for example, having a high tariff on steel and aluminum helps the steel industry and the aluminum industry receive higher prices for their products, but anybody who uses steel or aluminum is now paying more for steel and aluminum. So the auto industry or other industries that use steel and want to make fabricated steel products are having a little bit harder time. And so to some extent it just depends on the industry as to whether they're being helped or harmed by these policies. Same thing, we've had the sort of retaliation from China against soybeans in particular. So the net effect of all this is kind of small. It can feel really large if you're a soybean farmer, or if you're very dependent on purchasing steel, or if you're in an industry that needs to purchase steel, or if you're in an industry that's selling steel. So the effects can feel very big in some very specific industries, but overall for the whole economy, nothing really broad-based has happened yet. As far as it goes, I would say we're hearing a lot of talk about trade, and that's a big part of it. It's a long and difficult negotiation process to try to change trade agreements. But the reality is nothing big has happened yet.
At the start of January of 2019, the makeup of our Congress changed dramatically. Democrats now have a majority in the House, and that means that the administration might face some more hurdles as they're trying to get legislation passed. So what effect do you think that could have on the economy?
Well, I think the first thing I want to point out is that the government does impact the economy, but not as much as we might fear.
People would think.
Right.
Fear.
And so one thing to point out is we just had a change in administrations 2 years ago, right? As we went from a Democratic president to a Republican president, and we had changes in taxation, major tax legislation that we just spoke about a few minutes ago, a lot of saber rattling around trade. But what are we getting in terms of GDP growth? It's still the steady 2.5% to 3% growth. We still have low inflation. We still have unemployment falling by a couple tenths of a percent every few months or every year. And so that didn't cause as dramatic of a change as a lot of people thought. And I would say the same thing about a change in the House of Representatives, is that it's true that the Republican Party is going to have significant problems trying to pass legislation. But whether it's going to have some sort of major impact, that failure to do so is going to have some sort of major impact on the economy, I think, is unlikely. The major factors that really impact the economy are advances in technology and productivity, changes in the available size of the available workforce, changes in other resources that are available, or some sort of shock, such as from financial markets. And the government really doesn't have a whole lot to do with causing those things to happen. So if you look back at the core factors, fundamental factors that cause economic growth, the government plays a role, but it's not as significant of a role as a lot of people think. So that's why I'm sort of looking forward to this year and not really seeing a whole lot of change in terms of economic performance, whether or not one particular party can get their policies through.
Right. Our region's largest employer, the largest single-site employer in the state of Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, it has a huge economic impact, as we all know, $4.5 billion. They just gained a new mission, the F-35 mission, which will reportedly bring about 400 jobs here. What do you think the rest of 2019 will mean for Wright-Pat?
So I guess the good news in terms of trying to predict is the fact that their budget is more or less set as of the fall of 2018. In addition to that, the previous budgets had put into place the construction of additional space for the intelligence operations out at the Air Force Base. And so once that construction is done, not really sure when that's going to happen, but I think it should be soon, there will also be an increase to the mission there, as far as I can tell. So that'll be a further increase. The base is so extremely important to this region. It offers or provides this region with a lot of very high-paying jobs, a lot of highly educated people in the workforce and in the community who earn very high incomes on average, are either working for the Department of Defense or active duty Air Force or are working for contractors in the area.
Right.
So it's an undoubtedly, or it's without a doubt the single most important piece of our economy. So I don't see any negative occurring at the base. I think other than the two items that you and I just mentioned, which are both positives, I think everything else should be pretty stable over there for the coming year.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we should expect any sort of surprise with respect to the federal government's treatment of the Air Force and the importance of that base until it comes time to start looking at the 2019 fiscal year. Right.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. As you said, I don't think we can overstate the effect Wright-Patterson Air Force Base has on the economy here locally. Let's take a look outside the gates of Wright-Pat. What industries do you expect to grow in 2019? I always ask you to kind of pull out some of those industries that are maybe poised for some growth.
So I think one thing I want to point out is that the region's been doing pretty well for 8 years compared to most other Midwestern cities. So we've had roughly 2% or more job growth per year for quite a few years in a row. And again, we haven't had a period in the Dayton area like that since the 1990s. So that's very good. And the growth has been really broad-based. There's only a couple of industries that have struggled in the area. So for this coming year, I think we'll see continued growth in healthcare. That's just been a steady performer. Again, healthcare jobs tend to pay pretty well, and the opportunities there seem to be growing. So I look for continued growth in the healthcare industry and in all facets of that industry. Wholesale trade, transportation, warehousing had a good year. I expect it to continue growing. There's still some activity or planning, it appears, for the further expansion in that industry. So I think that's another area that I expect growth. And then in manufacturing, last year was a good year for non-durables.
Okay.
Food products and related industries, paper, other non-durable goods had a particularly good year. And so I'm going to keep an eye on that industry. There might be continued opportunities for growth there. So those are the industries that I think have the most potential for strong growth. The one industry that I think is really crucial to this area that had not a particularly strong year is business-to-business services.
Okay.
These are the larger companies that we see around the area that provide a lot of technical services for companies worldwide. LexisNexis, Teradata, they're going to be leaving the area soon. Reynolds and Reynolds, companies like this that provide business-to-business services on a national or even international basis. I still think there's potential for growth there, although this past year was not a particularly strong year, but I'm going to keep an eye on them.
Okay. Well, I think that healthcare, you've mentioned it almost every year we have met, so that's not surprising. Warehousing, logistics, I've seen quite a few headlines actually here recently that has been a really growing industry in the Dayton region. I think we focused more on our strategic location to try to attract businesses to the Dayton region, and it seems to have paid off. So it's good to hear that they are still on your watch list. Let's talk about those industries that you're watching for other reasons. Right.
So retail trade actually did better this past year than I anticipated,
really?
But I still look to retail trade as an industry that may be cutting employment in the coming year. I don't expect much growth, if any. So I think the best we could hope for out of retail is really sort of flat performance in terms of employment. It's not that consumers are purchasing less. It's just that they're purchasing differently. People will not stop purchasing goods from brick and mortar stores, but the increased use of online retail or purchases of services online and so forth are putting sort of a ceiling on retail trade employment, if not perhaps somewhat of a decline.
Okay.
So we'll see how that goes. I also think that information services is continuing to struggle. So this is everything from print publications, newspapers, or any other print media around the area. And secondly, television media might have less employment. That's been declining for a while. It's an industry that's just going through a period of, depending on the part of the industry. So in some cases, it's improved efficiency.
Okay.
Can some portions of the job be done mechanically or by machines rather than by labor? And then some of it is just less demand by consumers for newspapers in particular. So I think that's an industry that's struggling. It's not a big employment industry for this region, but I think that's likely to continue struggling. The one thing I want to point out too, as we finish up talking about employment, is that right at the end of 2018, employment growth overall in the region slowed, just for a couple of months. So it's too early to tell if that's really a trend or not, but it's worth keeping an eye on.
When we talk about workforce, you mentioned wage growth, and we've heard a lot about that kind of being a sticking point as our economy continues to grow. What does it take for those wages to rise to meet where the economy is?
So it's really sort of an issue of supply and demand. So as demand grows, eventually, and without further increases in available labor, eventually the only way businesses will be able to get more workers is to offer more money than competing firms.
Right.
And that's essentially what would cause more rapid wage growth. So it takes a long time, and it has over the last several recoveries from recessions. This isn't unique to this recovery. So it's taken a long time. It's more pronounced among professions with lower skill sets or lower education levels that are required for employment. But we did see on average, I think, a little bit over 3% wage growth last year.
Okay.
And so this is all sort of finally heading in the correct direction. One thing I think I mentioned in one of our previous meetings was that labor markets are notoriously slow to adjust. And so we can have a recession hit, and instead of wages falling, which would happen in a normal market, you just get huge mass layoffs. Or when the economy is recovering, instead of wages growing, you can get a lot of companies complaining about shortages of labor. But those shortages of labor would really resolve themselves much more readily if employers were willing to pay a little bit more.
Right.
And so the more desperately that businesses need to really hire that labor, the more willing they'll be to increase what they're offering to pay.
So kind of organically, it usually works itself out.
Yeah, just through the markets. But labor markets can be slow to adjust compared to other markets.
Okay. Well, we talk about the workforce and the end user, the consumer. Household budgets of people like you and me are pretty telling of how the economy is doing. And I usually try to end the show asking about, what folks in their household are feeling and how they're spending each year. Can you give us a feel of the overall thought process of the consumer?
Yeah, so right now, the Federal Reserve just completed a report that indicates that while there might be some households who are overextended and have taken out too much debt, it's not a national problem. That most households are sort of living well within their capabilities, so there's not that much concern there. And so households are in relatively good shape. Again, there's a whole spectrum out there, and some might be overdoing it, but by and large, households are in decent shape. From an income distribution standpoint, we do have continued growing inequality. People at the low end of the earnings spectrum are not seeing their wages rise as rapidly as those in the middle or the high end.
Okay.
And so that's also affecting the position that people are in to be able to afford what they need. But it's always important, I think, for households to remember sort of these core principles of running an effective household, which is to take care of the necessities first, shelter, food, clothing, medical care, And of those, medical care is the one item that we're expecting continued rapidly rising costs this year.
Okay.
And so hopefully households can try to plan for that, expect that their health care costs are going to go up this year. They know what their insurance plans are like and should have a sense for what that's going to be like. And it is difficult, but the other pieces of the necessity puzzle are we're not really expecting much inflation there. And so the cost of necessities are mainly going to be going up for health care.
Okay.
And then hopefully households are going to be responsible with the remaining portion of their income, that they should go out and enjoy their lives,
Right.
but still make sure that they're preserving some of that income for savings and for emergency needs.
Okay.
And so in that sense, it's a simple concept, right? But it can be easy to lose sight of in the
Right.
middle of a crisis, in the middle of a family crisis, or in
Right.
the middle of some temptation to take a very expensive holiday or something
we've
like
all
that.
been there.
So I think households are in good shape, and
Okay.
it's just a matter of behaving responsibly and being aware that healthcare costs really are continuing
Right.
to rise.
Did we see any change in behavior overall in general coming out of the recession from consumers? Were they more conservative, or did they just kind of go wild and start spending?
No, I think
there anything-
on average people are much more responsible and much more cautious about spending and about investing in particular. So I think a lot of people learn valuable lessons out of that.
Right.
And so I think as far as we can tell, looking at data, and people are sometimes maybe being overly suspect about another bubble existing somewhere.
Right.
And they'll happen again. We'll have another recession again. I don't want to make it sound like bad things will never happen. But,
Right.
But if anything, people are much more cautious and much more responsible than they used to be on average. And so I think there were lessons taken.
Well, that's good. We want to learn lessons. I think I've heard people talking about the markets as of late. Things have been a little volatile, and so I think there have been some nerves happening. Do you think that will even out as we head into 2019?
Well, it's really hard to predict what markets will do, but it's very important for people to not overestimate the importance of markets to the economy. So there are many instances where, while financial markets have gone through downturns and it has affected the economy, there are seemingly at least as many where the markets have had a downturn and it didn't really affect the economy. And actually, Paul Samuelson, one of the great economists of the 20th century, used to joke that the markets have predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions, and basically pointing out that he did not like to look at markets as a predictor of the economy.
Okay.
Now, people who have a lot of funds invested in the markets should be paying close attention and should be working with their advisors to try to make sure they're comfortable with their position in the markets. But in terms of it having a feedback effect on the whole economy, nothing that has happened yet should have a big effect on the economy. It would take a much worse situation before we'd be looking at a recession caused by the markets.
That's comforting. Okay. Well, it seems like the headline today is about the same as it always is when I meet with you, which is slow and steady growth.
Right.
And to be honest with you, I hope that never changes.
That's right. There's nothing wrong with that.
I would say I want a more exciting show, but I really don't. I like the slow and steady growth headline that you usually come out with. Is there anything that I missed that we should have mentioned?
I don't really think so. I mean, I think Dayton should recognize that, or the Dayton area, people in the Dayton area should recognize that, it isn't easy for traditionally manufacturing-focused cities to be growing very strongly right now. And so among those, Dayton is doing pretty well. And so as we transition gradually out of sort of a lot of employment that is distributed to manufacturing, to an economy that has much less employment in manufacturing, things right now are kind of evolving in that direction pretty well, about as well as could be expected.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, we've had some really great years here in the Dayton area. So thank you for coming and spending time with me again this year to start 2019. As I said earlier, it's probably your favorite way to start a new year. Am I right?
It's a pleasure. It really is.
Well, thank you for being with us and giving us your predictions and letting me put you on the hot seat. If you would like to watch predictions from last year, check out our YouTube page. We keep them all there so you can see just how accurate Dr. Traynor is, and it's pretty accurate, I will say. I do want to mention that the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce compiles economic data on a regular basis, and that is available to our chamber members as a member benefit. In fact, Dr. Traynor is a part of the panel of experts we put together to compile the 2019 Economic Outlook, which will be available in early February, both in print form and online at DaytonChamber.org. That is also where you can find our monthly economic indicators, which are released in partnership with Wright State University Center for Urban and Public Affairs. I'm Holly Allen, Director of Marketing and Communications with the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for being with us. Stay tuned for a message from our President and CEO, Phil Parker.
Each year we ask key volunteers from our area universities to give staff and leaders an overview of the region's economic forecast. Our team of experts has an excellent record in sharing with us its views of what to expect in the coming year. Today's program featured Dr. Thomas Traynor, Interim Dean and Professor of Wright State University's Soin School of Business, who shared with us his insights for 2019. 2018 was a good year for us in the Miami Valley. Manufacturing and construction appeared to have had a good year. Healthcare continues to grow, and our overall economic success has been better in 2018 than in many previous years. The crystal ball is never as clear as we would like it, and it seems to be clouded by the recent volatility of the stock market. However, 2019 should still average a slower but positive GDP for America and for our area. The world market is still a great influencer considering recent tariff issues with China, Mexico, Canada, and many others. Many of us believe these issues have to be resolved because of the effect on farm products, manufacturing exports, and steel imports. We hope you've enjoyed Dr. Traynor's perspective today, and with a few positive changes from Washington and the Federal Reserve, 2019 can be a solid year for domestic growth for business, job growth for American workers, and a reduction in onerous regulations that hamper the continued growth of the American economy.